Good morning. We are here today with George with New Hampshire Housing. How are you, George?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. I appreciate you joining me today.
I've got my morning coffee.
It's never too late for morning coffee.
Right, exactly.
So you're with New Hampshire Housing and you're the Community Engagement Director, is that correct?
Yeah, community engagement manager, and essentially I work within policy planning and communications, a lot of data research and housing education. So I do a lot of work with folks that are just interesting about the intersection between housing, economic development, housing design. How does housing policy locally at the state level impact the type and availability and the cost of housing in general? So kind of a big area. So it keeps me busy, and no day is like the other.
Yeah, I bet. Well, I was going to say we're talking about accessory dwelling units today, but it sounds like we could have an entire series just based on the little information you gave us.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Too funny. So, like I said, today we're talking about accessory dwelling units. I guess a good place for us to start is what even is an accessory dwelling unit and what kind of qualifies if we want to start there.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, because it is kind of a fancy kind of terminology, and it really, this is also kind of referred to as like a granny flat, an accessory apartment, lots of different in-law apartment. That's what what you might think of more than accessory dwelling unit. And essentially, accessory though is a really important word. So you could have an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, that's attached to your house, like an addition that's set up just as that, or it could be a converted attic, or maybe a converted space in your basement, or maybe detached, like a completely separate unit on your land, or maybe above your garage that isn't attached to your house. So that would be examples there of attached accessory dwelling units and detached. And really, the key thing about it is it's not just like to really qualify definitionally as an accessory dwelling unit, it's got to have separate sleeping, eating, sanitation, and cooking. So if you have a place that doesn't have one of those things, like maybe it doesn't have a cooking facilities, it's not technically an accessory dwelling unit. And I say that New Hampshire recently, or 2 years ago, passed an accessory dwelling unit law that was focused just on attached, and it has that in there as what qualifies for that, because there could be some homes out there that just have a little bit of that, and they're not necessarily technically an accessory dwelling unit, but they kind of serve a purpose. And in those kind of cases, it's probably someone that and they call it in-law because maybe it's someone that so you don't mind them walking into your kitchen and making breakfast.
Yeah, you don't mind sharing that common space.
Right. Opposed to somebody you do not know, and you'd like to have a little bit more, separate means of entry and everything else. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. And I do say that the word accessory is important because it means incidental. And I think a lot of questions when we used to talk about accessory dwelling units is what's the difference between that and a duplex? Well, a duplex is kind of an equal kind of thing. And they might both be, might be owned by someone and they rent both out. In the case of New Hampshire, at least with the accessory dwelling unit law, one of the units, whether it's the accessory dwelling unit or the primary dwelling space, is usually owner occupied.
Okay.
So maybe one is rented out, and it could be either or. So it's not like someone's bought it as commercial property, and it's not a duplex where they're both equally sized. An accessory dwelling unit, by definition, is generally smaller and incidental to the primary building.
Okay, so if you're an owner and you have like maybe a duplex or a 3-unit and you're looking to add another unit, it wouldn't necessarily be an accessory dwelling unit you're not living on that property.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Right. In most cases, and somewhere that kind of peculiarity might exist, but the idea here, at least from what we've learned and seen, the reason why New Hampshire Housing was interested in this is that we're always looking at the opportunities and the barriers to housing production, and this kind of comes up as an incremental thing, not a 40-unit apartment complex, but what can I do as a homeowner that maybe I'm looking to stay here and I'm thinking about what I might need 10, 20 years down the line, or I might be thinking about income. And so I'm looking at my property saying, do I build something in my house? Can I do that? Or something that it might be detached in my yard because I've got enough space. And how does that help me out with the things I'm concerned about? Maybe I want to have a relative live closer, or you're thinking about needing some kind of a caregiver. There's a lot of different reasons. And, we see that a lot of younger people now are coming back home for a lot of reasons, not the least which might be college debt. But even other people, maybe they're older and they want their parents to come, because their parents are downsizing. It's like, let's build an accessory dwelling unit. And I know in a couple of cases where colleagues and friends are considering that. So an accessory dwelling unit may be a really good option where people still have kind of their sense of privacy, but they're close in for a whole host of reasons, both family or non-family. So family can be a determinant here, but sometimes it's somebody, in the case of just shoring up your own income stream, you don't worry necessarily about that. But it can serve all these different purposes along the line.
Now, so when it comes to accessory dwelling units, are there kind of overall guidelines? I know when it comes to town regulations, each town can be different, but are there some like umbrella guidelines that need to be met in order for it to be considered an accessory dwelling unit?
Yeah, well, I go back to those 4 elements. It's gotta, if you're gonna do an accessory dwelling unit and for it to be sort of legal in your community, so the first step I would say is consult your planning department or your code enforcement officer, because there are regulations around that. And part of the reason for this New Hampshire's state law regarding attached accessory dwelling units was because there was such disparity and sometimes onerous requirements. One of which was, you have to have a door between the primary and the accessory dwelling unit, and it must remain unlocked. So getting back to trying to rent it to somebody you don't know, you may not want that. And so that was a real barrier maybe for some people. And so, so that's something that attached, so it doesn't speak to detached, but of course it wouldn't be an adjoining door in a detached. Those are some of the things to try to bring some things into some consistency. So as a homeowner, I kind of know what I'm navigating. But it's got to have those 4 things. It's got to have cooking, eating, sleeping, and sanitation. And then, I think that's the basics, and another means of egress. So you got to be able to, if it's attached, come in and out your own kind of door. And a lot of municipalities have some guidelines on how that has to look. Maybe it can't be a second front door. Maybe it's going to be off to the side. And in some cases, you might not even see that. But those are the 4 real elements. And within that, and this gets down to cost. Depending on what your town allows, some towns say, you can't have an attached dwelling unit that's more than 750 square feet, let's say. And so, that may be a limiting factor where you're trying to squeeze in those elements to make sure it works. But those are the 4 elements. And within that, coupled with a good designer, or architect, or engineer, you can kind of come up with whatever you want to make things work that fits your needs or your goals.
Okay. So if someone listening is considering putting an ADU onto their home, or, adding one in their backyard, like you said, are there different types of financing options for this in particular? Or do what kind of options are there for someone looking to go this route?
Yeah, and I think this is important. So we put together an accessory dwelling unit for homeowners guide that I'll refer you to. So if you go on to nhhfa.org website, under Housing Challenges and Solutions tab, there's a whole separate thing about accessory dwelling units. So we've got a guidebook for municipalities, for homeowners, and we have the AARP guidebook up there as well, to help walk you through this. But the thing about the finance is that this is why, even in communities that are worried about accessory dwelling units popping up everywhere, there's a real cost component to it. And so for those that are homeowners, myself included, I can look and say, well, how much does it cost? What do I have for my own liquid assets? What do I have in savings? Can I tap into my home's equity and maybe do a home equity line of credit, or a term loan? I can use that equity not just to have a line, but maybe just say I want all the money at once and have it be a term loan with a fixed repayment. Both would have a fixed term of repayment, but the home equity line is interest only until it's due. That would be it. So I might refinance my first mortgage with cash out, might do a home equity line or home equity loan. in the case of building something new, like say you're actually got a parcel, and it's like I want to build my primary and my accessory dwelling unit, then you can look at construction financing overall. That would then, you'd have to then either through the initial loan program, either that might convert to a permanent loan, or you must then, apply for a second permanent mortgage. And so you have to think about all those things. Plus, will you qualify? What's your income? We all know we might have equity, but you have to have an ability to repay. A lender is looking at collateral as sort of the last resort. They're looking at income, earnings, cash flow, and the like to be able to pay that down. And so I think those are considerations. And as I've talked with people about accessory dwelling units, really think about that. Where am I going to get the money to do that? And if you've got a banker, I would talk to them or a few bankers and say, what are some of your rates, your regulations, and so I can think about whether I can even go forward with that. And really, to that end, I would also consider, you got to talk to somebody about, does this even work in my house? So a really reputable builder or an architect, engineer, maybe a little bit of both would be important, because they'll give you a good idea of how expensive it might be to do. Because it's not really cheap to do it. And when you think about, again, having separate eating, sleeping, cooking, you might buy smaller appliances, but that's still an expense in a small area. And so it may go a wide range of costs, but that's why it's really important to figure out, what do I have my own assets, and what might I need to do to look at talking with a lender or lenders to find out financing options.
Okay. And I mean, kind of going back to what you said there, if your house is on private water and sewer, you may have requirements there. If you've got a 3-bedroom septic, yep, and you're looking to add a 4th bedroom in an ADU, now you've got that whole can of worms that you're opening, right?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. Exactly. And in a lot of communities where I've read the zoning ordinance, it might say that, okay, you don't, so you have to look at loading, and the zoning ordinance might say, so we're not going to make you build the larger capacity septic, but you have to have approved plans per DES guidelines. So I think that's a great point. Okay. When you're, and a lot of people, frankly, are not on water and sewer, and so you've got to think about those requirements, because you're, and someone will say, well, you're getting rid of a bedroom, maybe, or you're not really adding a bedroom, but you're adding other loading with another bathroom and another person living there. So the DES guidelines, while I'm not familiar with them, are very instructive, but I think it's a good point. You want to look at that and say, okay, not only do I have to consider the furnishings and how I'm building it, but what do I got to do with septic and water?
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, it's a good point.
And I'm assuming size would come down to the town, like town by town too, right? Is there a minimum required for an ADU, or? Yeah,
so if you are considering an attached accessory dwelling unit, then the state law has language on that, and they say that you can't restrict it to just 1 bedroom. You can't make it be less than 750 square feet, but you could allow a range. You could say, in my community, you can have one as small as 400 square feet and as large as 1,000 square feet. Okay. But you can't restrict it and say it must be less than 750. That's a state requirement for attached only. It doesn't mandate additional parking, but it says a town may look at that and consider what if they want to consider additional parking requirements. And in some places they limit occupancy, but that can get a little dicey just with federal regulations around home occupancy. But those are some of the things that would be considered. Some towns talk about separate metering, and some towns don't speak to that. And that might be a good thing, again, going back to your town, to say, what, if I do this attached or detached, what do I have to consider in terms of, separate electrical, metering or whatever. I haven't seen that in a lot of places, but those are all important considerations to go through. And I haven't looked at this in depth in a while, but I know that our homeowner ADU guide, and I think as well, and another really great resource is accessory dwellings .org, and I'll send you that in a link as
Okay.
because I don't think I necessarily need to share my screen. But Cole Peterson is sort of is a real expert in this. We had him up. He has a book called The Backdoor Revolution: A Definitive Guide to ADU Development, and it's Cole Peterson, K-O-L Peterson. And we have that book on our website, and it's really helpful in terms of checklists of things to consider. And so I would encourage your audience that are interested in, or people that they know that are thinking about this, to go to, number one, check out our website, because that at least will get you to those resources, to the AARP resource, which is a nice 20-page guide, and also accessorydwellings.org website that has some great information about costs, things to think about, checklists. And I think that's really important, because before, Cole's work, he's been really a pioneer in this. But, when you think about being a homeowner and maybe developing, it's not something you do every day. And so it's good to talk with a lot of people. That's why if you've got a builder, a banker, all those folks, your town planning or code enforcement, is going to give you some really good information to say, okay, I think I want to go forward. And again, going back to the state law, that benefit there was trying to make that consistent, so there weren't a lot of unforeseen, roadblocks or barriers. So that's what I'd offer.
Do you have, and this is totally random, do you have any idea, anywhere in the near future, do you see any of those ADU regulations changing statewide, or is everything, it's been pretty consistent, you don't really anticipate, or there's nothing in the pipeline for changes potentially?
Yeah, well, each community has the ability to change the regulations how they want. So the state law is a guideline, and some communities just sort of kind of looked at what that guideline was, and if they needed to change their zoning to fit that, then they did, but maybe they didn't do anything with detached. And so I don't have an inventory of what every community has done, but if I've got this right, I think in Pelham, they actually took away, this is for detached ADU, requirement, or maybe even attached, that the homeowner has to live in one of them, which I thought was interesting, if I have that right. And Cole Peterson had talked about that there's usually, that's one of the big holdouts, and I get it. We don't want to, if I live in a neighborhood, if the homeowner is there, there's certainly this feeling that they would then want to take care of their property and make sure it's not just unrelated people. We can go down that negative sort of visualization.
Mm-hmm.
So some communities already had a range, so I was pleased that they're not just holding to the 750. Many of them say, like, let's provide a range, whether it's either attached or detached. I think the detached, anecdotally, is one where I think people maybe are a little bit more reticent. I'm not sure why. There's communities that I would talk to and say, this is a big community with people with homes and maybe unused carriage houses from back in the day, and yet by law you don't allow that to be converted into another living space. And there are reasons that probably go into that are specific to that community and people's feelings about that. Mm-hmm. But there exist these opportunities, and I think some towns see that as an opportunity. I think why we feel it's such an important thing is that, again, it goes back to small D development. I'm a homeowner, I've got some land, I've got something maybe I can do, and it's existing land. So we're not sprawling out, we're using existing land maybe better. In the case that I just mentioned, the land was already used for a structure whose use has now become unnecessary, and might change it into something else. And that really starts at the local level. We're an aging community. As we were preparing for this call, I was mentioning to you that AARP does a study every year, a survey on for adults. Actually, it starts at 18, so it's not just for older adults, 65 and older. And for adults in the 65 and older category, about 65% of them are saying, yeah, I'd love to live in an ADU because I I want to, or have an ADU because I'm going to need that caretaker that I mentioned, or I'm going to still live in my community. I don't want to have to move somewhere else, but this house is too big for me.
Yeah.
And that's a really important thing. People are thinking about what's happening down the line. And I have gone to communities, this was before the ADU law, or one in particular comes to mind, where they were concerned about their older population. And as I just sort of asked them questions, it really became clear that their own zoning wasn't allowing flexibility and adaptability.
Okay.
And I think we're finding in this, COVID pandemic environment, is an ADU that's separate entrance or detached, is that gonna be helpful as we try to think about other living options? And I don't know, but one of the things would be is, does our land use regulations allow us to be resilient and innovative about our housing strategy? And as we even talk about potential, vacancy in commercial units, can they be converted? That now we're not talking about ADUs anymore, but where things can be flexible and adaptable to a changing environment. But I just think as we get older, and people are seeing, are in their older homes but want to age in their community, what are those housing options? And this may be one of them for that. And so that becomes something where just the interest happens organically, and maybe that then results in changed land use regulations locally, because that's where that has to happen.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I know you and I have talked about this, is the housing market, especially in New Hampshire, is so tight, both not only that there's not enough houses to sell and buy, but the rental market is so tight, and it just keeps raising those rents. So when you're looking, like you said, you've got a family member that's aging. We're seeing, the older population aging in place because there's nowhere for them to go. You're looking at
Right.
rents that are more than some of their mortgages. So,
Yeah. And it's truly a challenge. I mean, through the recession, 2008, rental gross rents, because we do an annual rent survey, we've been doing it for a number of years. And so we tracked that, and rents continued in, I think, every county in the state. So even Coos County saw at least an incremental increase on the median gross rent. So what the midpoint was. And what we also saw was just a continuing decline in vacancy rates.
Mm-hmm.
So now, as we've reported, our vacancy rate is less than 1%. So we've got this constrained housing supply for sale. We talked about low inventory,
Mm-hmm.
but there are people that are still able to, they've got the equity to buy and purchase over asking price, which creates just even more competition, especially those that have to really stick with underwriting guidelines.
Yep.
Younger millennials that want to buy a home that have to deal with, they can't pay overprice, and they may not want to pay and then, a fixer-upper and have to spend additional money to do that.
Right.
Because where's the equity, where's the cash to do that? And so again, this is a slow incremental, right? Because just by doing the ADUs, it's something that, and we talk about this, sometimes you don't even see an accessory dwelling unit. I have one on my street, and I didn't know about it until a friend told me about it because he was looking at buying it. I'm like, and then when I stopped and looked at it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's an accessory dwelling unit. It's attached, but I'm like, now I can see it, but you don't readily see it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing. And I think that's important because, like anything with housing, we have these thoughts of who the people are and what it's going to look like. And so it's great to have good examples of that work. And you realize, it's not something that may look bad. And it helps with these different scenarios that we may ourselves be facing. And so does our town allow? So I would say to folks, check out, especially on the detached side, what your town allows, because you may be in a place that just has a lot more land. Like I'm on a third of an acre, so I wouldn't really be able to do a detached one, nor would I if somehow I could. But if I live on an acre or more, or if I got a detached garage, maybe that's an opportunity to rebuild the upstairs.
Well, and I'm actually just kind of wondering this, I don't know if people actually think that, but do you think maybe there's a concern of, if I add an or if someone adds an accessory dwelling unit, someone may try and condex it and sell it separate. That's not a possibility though, right? You couldn't.
Right. And I think that's a great point. And communities have usually in their regulations say this cannot become a condoized or whatever. It's gotta be fee simple ownership so that you can't now if you're already in an existing condominiumized place, I mean, those rules obviously supersede. You can do whatever the association allows, but I can't build that and then decide that I'm going to sort of make that a condo, right? And usually communities got that in their regulations to make sure that can't happen.
Okay, so anyone who's thinking, oh, maybe down the road I'll sell it. No, you're on one plot, single family. That's what it stays.
Right, and I think what I have pondered is that if I build an ADU and then I sell it, not that I necessarily want to sell it to an investor, but the investor market may not really be able to get into that because they might not be able to fulfill the owner occupancy requirement.
Right.
And so, and so I think it's good, to talk to a realtor, right, and say like, what's the resale on this if I do this, and it might be a little bit more of a nuanced market. You would know better than I, but I'm not so sure if that would necessarily be a bad thing. And the other question is how much does it really raise the value from an appraisal standpoint? And so you do want to think about, your own property tax implications. And we talked with some appraisers about that. And it's interesting because the highest and best use is as a single family property. So when you have this detached ADU, sometimes it's not easy to figure out what that additional value is, even though, there is.
Yeah, true. Very true.
Yep.
So I guess, we're going to get the resources from you, the guide on your website. We'll link to the AARP guide. So like we talked about, but just to kind of recap, if someone's interested in doing this, really their first step needs to be to go to, I'm assuming it's zoning with their town or their city and figure out what the regulations are for that location.
I would do that. I would have a talk with your code enforcement person, your planner. I know some communities are very small, and so, but there's somebody there who's going to be able to point you to what the zoning is. And if you feel like you want to try it, in a lot of towns the zoning is right on the website, and they may, if you look in the definition section and you see there's a definition for accessory dwelling units or accessory apartments, chances are it's referred to later on in the ordinance. And so they probably will speak to attached and detached. And that's always good. But even as someone who reads those ordinances, I always want to go and really connect. I'm doing a small renovation and I'm able to encroach on my setback line with my deck, which I didn't realize it just doesn't pop out. So it's great to be able to have a good relationship with your planning department as I fortunately do. So yeah, that's a really good place to go. And then just widen that circle. Do you have a reputable builder that I've mentioned? So for me, if I was considering that the builder that's working on my house, I would be calling up saying, so what do you think? Like, what would that cost? Square footage concerns. But the town is a good one just to figure out what are your parameters, so that then you can take that and say, talk to your builder, and then at some point think about how can I finance this, and talk to your banker. Because depending, you may not necessarily be able to use the income as part of the underwriting if you're planning to rent it out, because maybe you weren't, someone who rented. But those are good questions to ask your banker, because maybe they would do a portfolio loan and they would allow, to use that income to qualify you. But maybe it's a portfolio loan rather than something else. But usually with a second mortgage anyway, it's portfolio in some way. So it just depends on what financing mechanism, if anything, you're trying to utilize. And I think the other element, we didn't really talk about this, but is thinking about if you need to worry about repayment, think about the overall cost. There's construction, there's labor and materials, but there's also design and permitting. That's septic. If you need to get an approved plan, what do you have to go through to get that and have an engineer stamp to approve that, things like that. Or contingencies in case, your septic does go and you're like, I got to have the money to come up with that to fix it.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
like I said, I so appreciate you taking the time to talk about
this is
ADUs
fun,
today. And, I think
right?
it's great. I mean, it's such great information to have. And like you said, with the housing market so tight in New Hampshire, it is in the best interest of everyone to at least consider it or not be, find out more
Right.
about it basically. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing as a homeowner, what's in it for you? And I think from the municipal standpoint, this is an incremental development opportunity. And like I said, on the detached side, towns may be more restrictive. There is a town in southwestern New Hampshire that in order to do it, that has 3 acre zoning, if you want to do a detached ADU, you have to have 6 acres.
oh,
And
wow.
it's unfortunate because I think it eats into, it just eats up a lot of land for a detached ADU, and that's unfortunate. And so I don't know what the rationale is behind that, but if that community was having and they do, or talking to themselves about options for people that live there, they may decide that, should be changed and be something that might work for that homeowner. And again, you're right, it's an incremental way to add more supply without really taking up tons of land and serves the homeowner's purpose. Some of which might be, again, having my kids or my relatives or a caregiver be on site. Some of them might be, let's just open it up for rental, and then that young person or older person is just trying to get their feet in the ground in the community to start a new job. It's there for them. So it
Yeah.
serve a lot of purposes over time. And even who's in what, the primary or the ADU, that might change as time goes on. There's a lot
True.
of
Yeah.
flexibility. So, but always happy to talk about it, anything housing related, and thanks for asking. And certainly if there are questions, and I will give you that link, but we're always happy to talk with groups about accessory dwelling units, and to have people think about it. And I think the other last thing I would say is, as a homeowner, you want to think about what it might mean to be a landlord. And,
True.
that's a consideration too. I don't know
An
if I'd
important
want,
component,
it
a
is.
role some people might not want to take on.
Right. And we touch on that in our book, and I believe AARP does too. So we certainly try to, our goal with our book is to be empowering. Was as a homeowner, it's like, how do I get to yes, because I want to do this? Great roadmap so you can figure things out along the way. But I think our contact information is in there. I'm always happy to talk with folks.
Okay, awesome. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah, thank you. Enjoy the
Well,
rest of your
hopefully,
morning and
we can
afternoon.
find another topic to get back
Yeah,
together and discuss, and maybe
happy
we'll
to do it.
hopefully hear from you again in the future.
Yeah, that's great. Happy to do it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. So long.
Bye.
Bye.
You still there?